Hello and a warm welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Alicia Second. Leaders from the BRICS countries gathered at the coastal city of Durban, South Africa for the 5th BRICS Summit this week. The outcomes and scheduled meetings between the BRICS group of countries will have a critical role in defining the future of developing economies. Let's take a look.
BRICS, which before the inclusion of South Africa in 2010 was originally known as BRIC. The bloc represents an association of emerging national economies, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. With the possible exception of Russia, the BRICS members are all developing or newly industrialized countries, but they are distinguished by their large, fast-growing economies and significant influence on regional and global affairs. As of 2013, the 5 BRICS countries represent almost 3 billion people, account for 19% of world GDP and 61% of overall global growth. This also explains why BRICS has attracted so much attention. BRICS has also put development high on the agenda. In recent years, it has extended its coverage of different fields to trade, banking, taxation, customs, agriculture, and culture. In 2012, a BRICS Development Bank was put on the table. Once established, it will serve as a stimulus to development in BRICS members, as well as in other emerging and developing countries. A BRICS Joint Reserve Pool and a Business Council are also under discussion, which are expected to forge closer financial and trade ties among members. However, there have been analysts that have highlighted potential divisions and weaknesses in the group, such as in India and China's agreements over the territorial issues and disputes between the members over UN Security Council reform. South Africa's role as a member of BRICS has also had mixed reviews, especially regarding what value the country can bring to the bloc.
The BRICS are going to be a very powerful force driving corporate transactions, driving economic growth and development in the world going forward. And China is very much the springboard of the BRICS. When you look at the BRICS, half of the GDP is represented by China, and they are the fastest growing and demographically most powerful group within the BRICS. But for the balance, South Africa within that is going to play an important role, and the China-Africa relationship and the relationship between Africa and these other countries is very, very important to the development of the continent. But globally, in terms of economic growth, the incremental growth that comes from the BRICS is going to dominate the next half century.
According to the IMF, in 2012, South Africa's GDP growth was revised from 3.2% to about 2.7% for the year. Comparatively, the rest of Africa was expected to grow an average of about 7% over the short to medium term. China and India, on the other hand, are expected to power ahead with between 7 and 10% growth. This has further raised questions about South Africa's position as a springboard into Africa.
South Africa has realized that in order to go forward from an economic perspective, from a business perspective, and definitely from a political perspective, there needs to be a lot more regionalization and cooperation at a regional level.
Joining me at the desk to analyse and contextualise the 5th BRICS Summit in Durban is Dennis Dykes. He's Chief Economist at the Nedbank Group. Chris Hart, who's a Chief Strategist at Investment Solutions as well. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me today. Let's get straight into it. Chris, we've got the 5th BRICS Summit in Durban having taken place this week. The theme, BRICS and Africa, partnerships for integration and industrialization. At the top, what's your opinion on us looking more so at a political grouping here as opposed to an economic one?
Well, as I said, it started off as a political grouping, and in fact, this particular summit, I think, is trying to find some economic and business relevance to the actual political grouping. It's a difficult grouping, in fact, to find some common overlapping mutual interests, because to a large extent, many of the strategic interests of the different BRICS countries are in fact quite disparate. In the sense of South Africa and Brazil, we're actually competitors in a sense to try and put raw materials into China. China itself is a controversial one in the sense from an industrialization point of view. China certainly has been sucking industry away from the rest of the world into itself and flooding the world with cheap goods, and that's of course a concern of other partner countries, in the BRICS grouping, and Russia would be included in there, but certainly South Africa, very concerning about our own industrial growth, which has really been languishing over the last few years. So this particular conference, I think, tries to at least glue something together from an economic interest point of view.
For now, though, what we are looking at to a large extent is a political grouping. And Dennis, it's an important premise to establish, where conversation has been time and time again that South Africa specifically is the smallest brick in the wall with very little clout, and highlighting that we're looking at huge economic disparities between these 5 members themselves. How much does that matter? Because surely if we're looking more so at a political grouping, then size doesn't really matter at the end of the day.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's actually quite good that you can be a member of a group of countries that really assume much bigger sort of political importance on the world agenda. And yet, we actually have a seat at the table. We've actually got a voice. So I think it is something which we've got to look at on fairly favorably from a political point of view. And it does mean that Africa's voice, which is often not heard, is being heard at least in one other forum. So I think from that aspect it's very, very favourable. I mean, we are the minnow from a economic point of view. Our GDP is roughly 0.7% of world GDP, and China is, depending on which measure you use, but on the so-called purchasing power parity measure, it's about 15%. So you can see immediately that there's a huge disparity there. But even between Russia and China, Russia's about 3%, Brazil's about 3%. Those are fairly small economies compared to China. And India, of course, is relatively big as well, compared to the Russias and the Brazils.
However, South Africa's economy in relation to Africa is big.
Exactly, and that is where the appeal lies for the most part.
Exactly. I think ultimately, as a political grouping, the BRICS is going to expand to include the likes of Nigeria, Indonesia, maybe Mexico and Vietnam. Those kind of countries which have also got fairly large populations and are emerging, and that would make sense, as that this is rather counterbalanced to the type of G7. That's the emerging market equivalent of the G7, as it were. And I'm sure at some stage these other countries may also be included if this grouping has legs in any case, to actually last a distance. In other words, does it find relevance in itself and also on the global stage?
We had Chris highlighting earlier, Dennis, that with these emerging markets being competitors with each other and to an extent being protectionist of their own economy, there may be a challenge in establishing a united voice, where we're looking at these partnerships of integration. To what extent is that a concern for you?
Well, look, if you're talking about trade zones, then those sort of issues become quite important, although ironically, economists look at things differently to the industrialists. Ironically, when you're looking at it from an economic perspective, you actually want countries of a similar sort of structure so that you increase competitiveness between those countries. So industrialists are competing against, and that forces the efficiencies and drives down prices. I mean, it could be worse for China, could be flooding the world with expensive goods, but we actually at least getting the benefit.
Always look at the glass half full here.
I think it's actually tremendous that there are people out there willing to work so hard for so little. I mean, and obviously the challenge for us is to find our niche within that. And in that sense, South Africa is actually in quite a good position, because we don't have to actually become dominant in any world market. We can find our niches, and we can actually compete.
To leverage off relationships, though, some saying, Chris, that it may be easier to do with some as opposed to others. I mean, maybe India, a better partner for South Africa, having been a British colony in the past, not wanting to be under dominance again and not wanting to play the role of a colonizer either. So coming into a relationship with a very different perspective with Africa to the likes of China, for example.
No, exactly. I think I certainly agree that India is probably a better long-term partner. They don't, as I say, people are suspicious about the long-term global ambitions and global reach that China could have. India doesn't have those aspirations, certainly not yet. And Brazil is still quite introspective, and Russia's a little bit of a mystery in a sense, certainly from the perspective of South Africa. Looking across there is a problem of perception of corruption there, where South Africa, where we're complaining about it, we are very, very clean, compared to the measures that you look at when it comes to Russia. And these are things that need to be cleaned up. Funny enough, all of these measures, the BRICS don't measure well on things like competitiveness and ease of doing business and that type of thing. South Africa is one of the one of the more favourable countries. They actually, South Africa, from a number of measures, actually scores better than China, India, Brazil, and Russia in many instances. And this is where I think we can actually leverage some advantage. We just don't realise that being a small country, we have to try harder. We can't just be comparable. We actually have to try harder to actually attract investment and business. But we are in many ways in a very, very favourable position.
In that context, let's take a look at some of the conversations that are happening. Prominent in the pre-summit discussions had been the establishment of this BRICS Development Bank. Viability in your books of something like this, a mechanism like this coming to the fore?
Well, my own feeling on that is that maybe it would have been better to have some sort of coordinating body that actually worked with the different development banks in each of the different regions, where, we've got whole layers of development banks. This will be an additional one. But I think it's very important to realize that the BRICS Development Bank is going to be set up almost in opposition to a World Bank. So again, there's a very political dimension to it. But it's ultimately it depends on how it's actually constituted, because if everyone throws in the $10 billion worth of capital, that's not a huge bank. It has extremely limited resources, and yet it would actually stretch us.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Even with that price tag being so small, relatively speaking, bottom line, can South Africa pay that price?
Well, it comes at a problematic time. Obviously, we've had ratings downgrades. We are somewhat cash strapped if you look at our current account deficit and you look at our fiscal deficit. So it's not an ideal time for that. The ideal thing would, of course, be to follow a similar sort of model to World Bank, IMF, where people actually have quotas that represent the similar size of the economy, so that they're able to actually do that.
Well, ultimately, we may well see things boil down to that in itself, and therein lies the risk of things getting naturally skewed here. To what extent do we price in that risk, with economic might possibly leading to that skewed influence, because contribution to the bank and the distribution of that associated risk would vary, and in so doing, the influence on the fund's decision making comes to light.
No, exactly, but I think they're starting the bank off with all the member states on an equal footing. And that, I think, helps to bed down the problem that you'd have of maybe Chinese dominance in that kind of fund. So in a sense, instead of getting finance directly from China with the fears of neocolonialism, as people would call it, etc., you've now got a fund that's more that doesn't have, political dominance ambitions, and certainly not initially. And so you may well find that countries in Africa accessing that development finance may find it more palatable than getting it directly from China or India or Brazil directly, or even the World Bank and IMF. It gives an alternative. Where I think could be very interesting, it will be a political creation, but it will create an economic hub, as it were, where you start gaining greater business relevance to the BRICS concept. The big thing is, do the politics stretch to actually then use a currency other than the dollar in time to come? And that would be interesting, because that's where the actual real competition with the World Bank and IMF could come.
While those conversations happen, we also have to ask the question, Dennis, do we stand the risk of alienating ourselves from those multilateral development banks, notably a player like the World Bank, developed nations as well, and then other emerging market peers as well?
There is that danger. My personal view is that it really depends how actually it is constituted. clearly you can actually have even unequal capital contributions, but you can have equal voting rights. It doesn't have to be exactly the way the World Bank is put together, So you can get around all those sort of issues, and that's why I said it's very important that it plays almost like a coordinating role between existing, like for example, the African Development Bank, our own development bank, so that you're not excluding, but you add in too. And add in the firepower, the capital raising power of those institutions. And then it could work very, very well.
My sense is that instead of alienating the IMF and World Bank, they may actually have to work harder for their own relevance in that sphere. But it's going to be interesting. It's another ball thrown into the game. And how the game develops is going to be actually quite interesting. But these are countries that can stand on their own feet. They can't be bombed and they can't be invaded and that sort of thing easily at all. So I don't. It does help to rebalance a single polar world into a more multipolar polar world.
I mean, at this point, it would be very symbolic because the amount of capital it's got versus a World Bank is extremely tiny if they're going ahead in this sort of basis. So I don't think the World Bank's going to be intimidated. But it's really sending a political message. And the political message is really that China, in particular, and Russia would like to have more say in the World Bank's affairs. So it's almost like a little bit of a bargaining chip as far as they're concerned. They're willing to pay the price of putting additional capital in. And we would be the beneficiaries along with the rest of Africa, providing, as I say, the rules are set up correctly.
Absolutely. I mean, where you talk about the symbolism coming through there, the fact that if we do look at different countries paying a different entry fee in terms of funding this bank as a whole, South Africa may not contribute to that. Some of the commentary has been, but ultimately we'd see this organization financed by other members, specifically China, and then setting up the bank with a home base in South Africa would be symbolic as well. Symbolic, but also coming with a lot of benefit for the BRIC members. So by setting up in South Africa, you've got the BRICS members gaining access to the regional grouping that is SADC. I mean, that makes up what 15 countries. It's a GDP total of $575 billion, and that's certainly nothing to scoff at.
Exactly, and I think people said it's BRICS with a small s, but if you said it's actually Southern Africa, we are proxy for SADC or Southern Africa, is that we've got the population to go with it, and the economic growth overall in the region is certainly something there. South Africa obviously needs to up its game as far as its own growth rate is concerned. But in terms of there's other issues, I think, like corporate governance, for instance, much better located in South Africa than would be in China, India or Brazil.
Well, let's hit pause on the conversation for now, because while it certainly is difficult at this stage for many to justify South Africa's inclusion into the BRIC acronym from an economic perspective, certainly the country remains the most developed of sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, and in this regard it can be seen as the continent's representative on this body. We'll have to take a quick commercial break right now, but when we come back we get the views from Global Credit Rating on BRICS. Stay tuned, because we put the focus on the BRICS relationship with Africa specifically. Welcome back to Invest Africa, where we're talking on the back of the 5th BRICS Summit. And still with me at the desk is Dennis Dykes, Group Chief Economist at Nedbank, Chris Hart, Chief Strategist at Investment Solution, and joining us now to take a look at BRICS and Africa specifically is Melanie Brown. And she's, of course, the CEO for Global Credit Rating. Welcome, Melanie, and thanks so much for joining our conversation. This is, as we've been talking about, the 5th official summit. It's the 3rd that South Africa is participating in since joining the grouping. To what extent does that, in your book, stand as testament to the longevity of the political will which actually underpins this grouping?
Well, I mean, it's important that South Africa is represented and representing the African continent. I mean, for this grouping to have any credibility in representing the global south, Africa had to be represented there. So for South Africa to be a part of it, it's huge testament to our position on the continent.
The criticism that has been leveraged towards it, though, is that while the political will and the commercial momentum may be there, it's not yet been converted into the institutionalization of the group's structure as a whole, and implementation of policies of action has been lacking. Do you see the summit being more than just a talk shop?
It has to be. I mean, going forward, there's been so many discussions leading up to this point in time that I think that itself speaks to what needs to come out of the summit these next couple of days. There needs to be an action plan, there needs to be commitment, and there needs to be a clear vision in terms of where this is going to go.
Where are your confidence levels sitting, Dennis?
Well, look, I mean, I think I'd have to say that one of the reasons for the development bank idea is that was something that they could actually concretely put on the table. It's not easy to come up with any sort of trade ideas because we're not in the same geographic areas. We've got vastly different sort of economic structures and so forth. I think my confidence level on the BRICS Development Bank is fairly high, but that's mainly because it's relatively easy to achieve, and I say relatively easy.
And also because you can see the merit of this auxiliary funding mechanism coming to the fore, because it would fulfill ultimately the infrastructure or the funding needs for infrastructure projects on the continent as a whole, and it's that highlighting or putting on the table accessibility to resources that the other members all want access to.
No, exactly. They will be competing for resources, and you know, the whole point about an emerging market grouping is there's always need for funding for infrastructure, and you know, but we need to be mindful that when it comes to how will these funds actually, where will they eventually go? And we need to be mindful that India is infrastructure constrained. Okay, Brazil is infrastructure constrained. In comparison, our infrastructure is actually fabulous. All right, and that's going to be the difficulties. I know there's some, how could you say, bottlenecks in power development and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, South Africa's infrastructure really is ahead of certainly Brazil's and India's, you know, in terms of what it has to actually deal with, and the actual load and economic activity load that it has to actually take. But clearly, infrastructure is also is a constraint here, and it needs to be expanded. But the actual, how can you say, the really investable projects, in other words, the projects that have high return because of the sheer need and necessity will be in Brazil and India.
Yeah, but that'll certainly be interesting to see how that entire thing evolves. Also the pricing at which funding will be accessible at the end of the day. Lots of talk, Melanie, around the BRICS nations expected to be looking at creating their own credit ratings agency as well. Let's put the viability of that into focus right now. Where do you see things standing on that front?
You know, in my personal opinion, if there was ever going to be a competing agency to the big three, it's now. I think the knock to their credibility over the last few years has been significant. The world, and specifically, I would think the emerging markets, are crying out for an alternative. So I know from GCR's perspective, this is an initiative that we began beginning of last year. And we're quite far into the process now. And it's exciting because, as I said, I think if this was ever going to work, there's a very small window, and the opportunity is there.
Dennis, are you excited by a prospect like this? Because it would be a step towards a more objective assessment of the economic health of the BRIC countries, and that would in turn have an impact on, you know, the market positions of national companies and then the banks themselves that operate in these countries.
Well, arguably it could be a more subjective assessment.
Rather you voicing that then.
Which is why Russia, I think, is so keen on the idea in particular. Look, I think obviously the big rating agencies have made mistakes over the last, it's indisputable, but I mean a lot of bodies have made mistakes over the last couple of years. The world's changed dramatically. The issue really is, though, where do you want to access funds from? Because if you're going to be accessing the big US institutions, they're not going to look at a BRICS rating agency more favorably than an S&P, whatever the faults. Maybe over time you'd build up that credibility, but it would be a very, very long journey. So if you want to access Chinese funds, then I mean clearly that might actually be a facilitator.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing is it will have some sort of political backing, as it were. And when it comes to ratings, that's even more dangerous than what the private sector mistakes can be. And you'll notice this when we get upgraded. The rating agencies got it right. They're recognizing the progress we're making. We get downgraded. They get it wrong. No, you don't believe them. They, you know, that kind of thing. And so one wonders, for instance, if the rating agencies came up and said, okay, China, you BBB, would they be fired? You know, at what rating do they need to come up with for the emerging markets, and specifically their paymasters, as it were, to keep their jobs, as it were, and still be reasonably credible? So, and I know I'm being cynical here, but one's got to be very careful of how could you self-auditing, if you like.
Absolutely.
Is that we need something that is independent and credible. If it's not independent and credible, then forget about it.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to you all for joining me at the desk today. That's all the time we have for this edition of Invest Africa. Of course, my guests at the desk with me today, Melanie Brown, Africa Director for Global Credit Rating, Dennis Dykes, Nedbank Group Chief Economist, and Chris Hart, Chief Strategist at Investment Solutions. It's goodbye from me, Alicia Seckham. Until next time.